Okay, hello, and thank you for having me here. So I am Mikael Anderson. I work at Paradox Interactive, and today I'm going to be talking about interactivity in video games, especially in grand strategy games, but I hope that this will be more widely applicable to your projects as well. Specifically for this talk, I'm going to be looking at how we created a historical narrative despite Victoria 3 being a very alt history game. So first I'm going to be talking, or the agenda for today rather, is basically looking at, first of all, the problem that we were dealing with on Victoria 3 during development. But rather than going straight into how we solved that, I'm going to take a quick detour and talk about different models of describing interactivity in video games and how we can then use those models to help us define what the solution could be better. Right? So I'm going to walk you through it. But basically, my objective here today is talk about interactivity, what it means in video games, and how that can be used in your games. Yes, all right. I'm going to jump in to introduce myself a little bit. So I started in video games 7 years ago as the lead designer for Victoria 3, which was in pre-production at the time. And I'm now co-directing the game with Martin Anward at my side. And prior to that, I worked not in video games. I worked in software project management, but always dealt with games in some way or another, specifically in analog storytelling kind of games, like tabletop role-playing games and LARPs and board games with a story focus. And on a personal note, and it's also very much reflected in the work that I do, I have a very strong fascination with systems and how humans deal with systems and how it changes the way that we live in the world, right? And that, with that, I'm going to jump into presenting Victoria 3 for those of you who don't know what the game is, because it's very, very topical to that. Victoria 3 is a grand strategy game that is about society building. And it takes place during the Victorian era, between 1836 and 1936. And players are taking on the role of a country, in a way, and can pick any country in the world to play during this time. And your ultimate goal, there's no sort of preset goal. You set your own goals for what you want your country to turn into, but of course there's always the possibility or the threat of not existing by the end game, right? So that is the sort of existential crisis that you have to deal with, and that threat can come from within or it can come from without. And when I say that you're taking on a country, sort of, it means that you're making decisions on part of the country on a very macro scale. But your country, the population of the country, will feed back to you throughout a lot of different game loops that all feed into each other. So as an example, if you take, as a player, the decision that you need a better education system to educate your people and get them qualified to take better jobs and build up your industry, you have to go through a process by which you enact a law that establishes the school system. Your population will have opinions on that and will, perhaps this could cause some sort of political turmoil in your country while the law is being enacted. Once it is enacted, you have a school system you can start pouring bureaucracy into. And that will change the education access of your population. It will increase their literacy, but with that increase in literacy, they will change their political leanings, perhaps, which will demand different kinds of laws from you. Or they may find that the place where they work don't actually have access to the kind of jobs that you've been educating them for, which might cause them to migrate. And this is all done through a very deep population simulation that is basically the foundation of the game. So your actions are on a high level, it affects the population, and that in turn feeds back to you and presents you with new challenges all the time. So the problem that I'm going to be presenting then is we have a historical game. It's very specifically set during this era, and we start out very clearly with, in 1836, with a historical setup that is as close to history as we could make it. And players play the game in part because they're excited about that era. But we're also very much inviting the player to change history, to create a different kind of country. And I didn't mention this, but it's obvious to you if you played a lot of other Paradox grand strategy games. All the countries in the world have their own AI, right? You can play this game in multiplayer, or you can let the AI control the other countries. So there are 200+ agents constantly doing their own thing and will react to the simulation as it goes. So we can't guarantee that you're going to get a historical outcome, and in fact, we're inviting you to change history with this game. So how then do we deal with this conflict between historical immersion and an ahistorical outcome? So I'm going to be talking first about different qualities of interactivity here. This is from Dr. Janet Murray's book, Hamlet on the Holodeck. She identifies 3 core qualities that makes a player feel that a work is interactive, is responding to them, is communicating with them in a conversation. And the first one is immersion, which I just hinted at. Players really want to feel as though the world is real and respond to them in coherent ways. If they do something and they get nonsensical feedback, then it's not going to feel real to them. If there's aliens that land in 1880, it's not going to feel real to them because this is a historical title, right? The second one is agency. Agency means that to give the player the opportunity to make decisions. If you're just running a simulation and there's no ability to interface with that simulation in some way, this is not an interactive work, right? So they also want to feel in control. If you have some options, but you take an action and the consequences of that is not something you could have predicted, or if an AI country does something that you had no heads up about, then you're not going to feel in control and you're not going to feel a sense of agency. And the third one, this is a term that I'm misusing a little bit because fundamentally in the book, it means transformation means that it affects some sort of transformation within yourself, the player. But I'm using it a little loosely here to mean transformation of the game state, a transformation of what is happening. You could potentially have a game with where you give the player a lot of agency, but their choices don't ultimately matter. This is something you see a lot in, for example, visual novels, where you're presented with different dialogue options, but they all sort of lead back to the same path, and the other characters in the game don't remember what you've said before. And this is a kind of false choice. It doesn't transform the world properly. And these 3 features are all core elements of interactivity. You want to try to maximize them as much as you can, although you have to make compromises from time to time. So then let's talk about the conflicts in terms of this particular problem. Players buy the game and they think they're going to live the Victorian century, 1836 to 1936, but they want still the ability to act within that, right? But they carry a preconception of what history is and what the cause and effect of history was, right? They also want agency. They want the ability to make changes. If we give them the ability to make changes, and we want that to be immersive, one sort of shortcut we could do is what I said before. Like we could make it a false choice. We could say, yeah, you made this choice, but in the end, we're going to force this historical path anyway. It's not something that we want to do, right? So we want the player to feel like they're actually creating a society that they're looking for, that they're working towards something, and that they're making visible progress towards that, but still feel like they're immersed in the era. So this is our defined problem. Historically immersive narratives can be sidelined by agency, but overriding agency impacts transformation. So now I've formulated the problem. This is the kind of process that you could do yourself in your own designs. Just looking through these interactive qualities and go, okay, where do I have conflicts, right? And this is very much what I want you to take away from this, because you're not going to run into the exact same problem that we are having, but use the same principles. So now I'm going to take a detour and talk about generally how we do this at Paradox. We have a number of titles that are part of the Grand Strategy series of games. Crusader Kings is the one mentioned here, but also other titles, Hearts of Iron, which deals with the World War II, and Stellaris, that is a far future 4X kind of space empire game. And a few other titles like this. And in all these titles, including Victoria, we employ this idea of random events that pop up. And this is a very familiar concept in a lot of strategy games and other titles as well, management games even as well. But the way that we do it is specifically to try to create this sense of immersion and emergent gameplay, emergent storytelling, right? Where we're not trying to force the player down a certain path, but we're trying to let them craft their own story, right? And the way that Crusader Kings 3 does this, it's a very character-focused game. This is basically, I describe it as Game of Thrones without the dragons and the magic. It's a medieval dynasty kind of management game where you are playing ultimately one character at a time, but your larger goal is to ensure that your dynasty will retain claims on territory and grow their realm and power across multiple centuries. And when your character dies, you play as your character's heir, right? So it's always a very character-centric game, and most of the events have to do with characters. In this case, you have a member of your court that comes to you with a request of what to do about another member of the court. And the outcome of this event, which triggers randomly, but based on some set of preconditions, the outcome will affect your character's relations with both of these, but will also affect some other change to the game state. Maybe one of the characters dies or becomes imprisoned or becomes promoted to some higher title, right? And we sometimes organize these events in chains. So you have to complete part 1 before part 2 has a chance to trigger. But often the best kind of stories that you hear about people talking about online is when we don't do that, when we have a series of disconnected events with preconditions under which they can occur, but we don't predefine them. They occur organically in a sort of conversation with the player and in response to the game's mechanics. So if you choose one of the options here, that's going to change something in the mechanics that will cause other events to randomly appear in the future. And this weaves a kind of mosaic that's unique to each player, unique to each playthrough. And this is the way we like to do things. So of course, that's the approach that we took when we wanted to design Victoria 3. We first took a look at the predecessors in the series. Victoria 1, which you see on the left-hand side here, has events that are very historical. They sometimes trigger on specific dates. They will trigger with very specific information. I don't know if you can read this, but this specifically names Adolf Disterweg, a German educationist who writes a book that becomes the predecessor of the science of pedagogy. And this is the thing, it even mentions the year of his death, right? And this is not a character that exists in the game. This is just a predefined event that's been written up to be something that lets players feel like they're playing through a historical narrative. And the effect here is that you get 20 research points. There's no agency here. You just happen to get this event and you get some research points. But it is very immersive. In Victoria 2, this is a sort of variant on the same event. This talks about a liberal author who has written a book it talks about where the liberal author was born and in what state he wrote and distributed this book. And players have some options here. They can either choose to try to contain the spread of this liberal text, which will have a greater impact on the state where it was originally published, or they can choose to spread far and wide and try to embrace liberalism across the country, which will have a diminished effect, but on the entire nation, right? So there's some agency here. There's some transformation here, but it's a little bit lower score in the immersion department because this is probably an event that more players will see, but it's more generalized, it's more generic, but it's not quite as immersive. Right? So when we set out to do Victoria 3, we didn't really have the language of immersion, agency, transformation. That was something that we discovered later, but we still had an instinct for it, and you probably also, as designers, have an instinct for this stuff. So we thought we can do better than this. We can try to score high in all these different fields. So we put together a new kind of event format. This one has to do with inefficient agriculture, and it specifically names a political interest group, the industrialists, who are complaining that there's just too much subsistence farming going on here. We need to enclose this land and make it productive. And so we have the trigger conditions, like the other events, right? But now they're much more, they're not triggering on a specific year, they're not triggering on a specific schedule or anything like that. They fire when it's relevant. So in this case, this event fires when there's a lot of subsistence agriculture in a certain state and you haven't had this event yet. So that's decent scores for immersion and agency. We employ a kind of smart scoping technique where when we instantiate the event, we also read off the game state and we can save some sort of game entities as scopes in the event so that we can actually use that to inform the text of the event as well. This is, and Victoria 2 did this as well when it's talking about the state where the author was born. But here we're specifically talking about the subsistence farms in Flanders. And we could have adapted this event to talk about a different kind of building in a different kind of state, right? And it's still the same event template, it's just instantiating in a different way. And this helps with immersion, absolutely. For event options, we absolutely didn't want most of our events to just be a single option. Sometimes we still use this format, but it's really only when we want to alert the player to this cool thing just happened, by the way. For most of our events, we do have 2 or 3 options. And each of those things should be letting the player take sides, really. A lot of our events come back down to these political interest groups that I mentioned. And so this event, you can choose to disappoint the industrialists and say, no, the people are fine where they are, leave them alone, we're not going to enclose the land. Or you can choose to go along with it, and it will affect the approval of either one of these interest groups, and it will also have some other effect. In this case, if you discourage subsistence farming, you get more migration attraction to there because people think this is a good place to go and farm my land. but 5% of upper strata pops in Flanders become more radical. So tying back to the population simulation that I talked about earlier. And this was the approach that we wanted to use to try to hit all of these 3 points, and at the same time weave this kind of mosaic that for example, Crusader Kings also employs, and get the player to tell their own story, their own way in each playthrough. What we found, and this goes back to the problem, I'm still on the problem part of this presentation. What we found is that this can be disruptive to gameplay because these events may fire in situations where the player doesn't expect them or where it feels like it's the wrong context. For example, if the player gets this event when they're in an existential war, they go, why? Why are you coming and complaining to me about subsistence farming when I'm in the middle of fighting this huge war? Someone's trying to invade our space and things like that, right? And it might be realistic, it might be immersive from that perspective in some cases. Yeah, sometimes you have to juggle a lot of balls in the air at the same time. But it was still something that we felt took the player out on a meta level. It was like, I'm engaged in this part over here now. Why are you interrupting me with this thing? And nobody wants to write events, right? As game developers, we don't want to write events that are disruptive to gameplay. We don't want to add things that are distractions or annoyances. So this was a bit of a problem for a lot of the random events in the game, and led us to think that maybe we need to do something a little different than what most of our other games do. So, tilting again, I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit, but some of you who are experienced narrative designers might go, this is a pacing problem, and you need to employ some sort of pacing model to this. And here's like one of the most classic pacing models that exist for narratives today. It's very well understood, and it's basically, yeah, you're building up tension as you go until you reach a climax, and then there's a denouement. The issue with this is very immersive. This holds audience interest. So it's great for that. It keeps players hooked. And many, many games, especially more linear games, employ this kind of structure. The problem is it really lacks in interactivity, because as soon as you start building in a lot of transformation into this, a lot of agency into this, it complicates the narrative design so much. And it's not really conducive to the kind of event-based storytelling that we like to do at Paradox. Yeah, as an example, you could have a situation where you say, well, if the player is in a war, then that's like the climax of this particular storyline. And then we're done with these other events, right? But the war itself is not an event that transpires in the way that we understand events in our games. It is a game mechanic, right? So we need to then check for every single one of these conditions, which becomes really, really complicated. So this is a model that I came across earlier this year. This is by Dr. Hartmut Könitz, who's an interactive narrative scholar. And this I find actually really useful to describe what is actually going on in a video game or in an interactive narrative of any kind. Here we have the experience, the story, being split up into 3 different sections. And it's a top one, the proto-story. That's the bit that's the actual designed game, right? This is the template from which all other games or all other stories can come from. Next up, we have the instantiation. That's when a player actually plays the game and experiences the game. They interact with the proto-story, with the system that we've designed, and change what the actual outcome is. And then the resulting product is a story. And here we have also these two loops, right? The player is interacting with the system, interprets the system, for example, figures out, strategizes a plan for how they should do the next kind of step in their story, and that affects how they are actually making their next move, and then they're interpreting the story as we go. So now we'll zoom in further to the proto-story. Here are some elements of the proto-story, right? So we have an environment, we have some boundaries during which play can progress. We have the assets. In our case, we have a huge world map. We have a UI as well, and various, the event window you saw before is part of that. And then a big component of the proto-story is this narrative design. And in narrative design, one component, and this can take many forms, but one component is what Dr. Kunitz calls a narrative vector. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. This is basically the model to solve the solution, or to solve the problem, is that we need to design our narrative vectors to maximize the immersion without hurting the agency and the transformation, right? This is a conflict that we have, and narrative vectors I'll describe next, and you'll see why that is a good solution to this problem. So a narrative vector is basically motivation for a player to engage in part of the story, and in turn, we can then deliver assets to them. We can deliver content as part of them engaging with this narrative vector. You can think of it as a kind of chapter in a book, but of course the chapters aren't predetermined here. They're branching or they're completely disconnected from each other. And it becomes another layer in the narrative design. So a typical example of a narrative vector is a quest. Very visible, always present. You can pull up your quest log at any time and see, okay, this is what's happening right now. And I'm motivated to embark on a quest because I'll get some reward or I'll advance a story. And in the process of carrying out the quest, you make different decisions, you get served different kinds of content, all good, classic example. Another one is level design. You could have a very linear game where just level 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and that's fine, and maybe there's a story being told in between, but you still have agency and transformation that occurs within the process of going through the level, and you're motivated to go through the level inherently. Some more out there examples. I think you can probably find a lot of examples of this on your own as well, but a couple more. Progression mechanics, like technology trees, I think is a fantastic kind of way of identifying narrative vectors. In this case, this is Kerbal Space Program, I think, their tech tree, and it's, you know, in order to reach the moon, you have to research the next level of propulsion mechanic. And in order to do that, you have to do this thing, and you have to do this thing, right? So while you're progressing towards this, you use this as well to deliver content and engage the player. You could potentially, although I haven't ever seen it, but you could potentially even use meta progression schemes like achievement hunting and new avatar skins and things like this to say, okay, you're clearly progressing towards this. This is your goal. This is your motive. Now I'm going to give you things that relate to this. And because it relates to them, it's not a distraction, right? So we started working with identifying some aspects of the game. Rather than having a big library of random events that we have to figure out good conditions for, we identified moments in the game where it's like, okay, the player is specifically motivated and understands that this is important right now, and we start tying random events to those. So elections is one of them. Not every country in the Victorian era is democratic at game start, but some are, and many of them can be during the game. And when that happens, your country automatically gets elections every 4 years. And there's a 6-month period in which there is a kind of election campaign going on, where the different interest groups try to compete against each other, organize into parties, and try to become elected. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to serve up some events relating to your country, but also relating to the election. So each of these events will affect the outcome of the election somehow, but they can also have follow-up or side effects. So they could influence, for example, what kind of promises you're making, or what some interest group's clout is going to be in the future if you choose this option. Another one is a law enactment vector. I mentioned at the top that, like, you want to institute a school system. You don't just spend a resource and press a button and now you have a school system. You have to actually get this law passed. And what interest groups are actually in power in your country matters. So in this case, because of the composition of your government, in this case, this is an extreme example, we're trying to enact a presidential republic. We're trying to actually change the way that the country is ruled. And the groups in power, which you see there, these groups in power, the ones that are in government have very low support for this. They're really not on board. So my success chance is very low, and my chance of this stalling out is 77%. And we implemented a kind of clock mechanic where during the enactment process, this clock will tick up, and every time the clock hits 12, you'll get a new event, and that the event that you get is based on these chances. So in most cases, 3/4 of the time, some event is going to be served to you that just makes it harder and is likely to make this law fail. But you can, in the context of these events, make decisions that that lets you compromise on this. So you could say, okay, I'm getting extreme pushback on this, but if I accept the setback now, and I accept maybe giving this other group more power, it's going to be easier for me next time. Next time the clock strikes 12. And in this way, you can kind of try to force laws through that otherwise are not popular. But this becomes another vector for us. We know that the player has said they want this law, so this becomes another vector for us to try to serve up events that make sense. One of the more extreme things that can happen if your political enactment process fails or you're not giving the people what they want is revolution, where your country splits in two, with some political groups organized on one side and others on the other. And that could also trigger things like foreign interference. Could be a great opportunity for another country to get involved and support one side or another. And here we employ a similar kind of clock mechanic and revolution type events that really illustrate the factionalism that's going on and lets the player decide. Because in some cases, the players might want to side with the revolutionaries, and in other cases, they might want to preserve the old order, right? So we're giving the player a choice of how to progress their country. We're not enforcing a particular path, but we're making sure that they have the historical immersion and the context when that happens. And the final thing that we identified are journal entries. And this is a bit that we've developed the most. And this is basically our version of quests. But in most games, if you get a quest, you're supposed to complete it, right? You get a reward at the end. In our case, we use these as basically like signposts for this is something that's going on in your country right now that's very important, and you need to deal with it in some way. And the system's very flexible. You can basically think of these as like macro events that kind of stick around for a long time. In this particular case, this is from our upcoming Brazilian region pack that we're launching in a couple of weeks. And it deals with the reign of Pedro II. And Pedro II is a member of the royal family, But he has very progressive ideas. He's aligned with the intelligentsia. He really wants to make Brazil into a better place, abolish slavery, institute a bunch of reforms. So he has an agenda, and that's really what this journal entry is about. As a player, you can choose to side with Pedro. You're not playing as Pedro, remember, you're playing as the country. But you can choose to side with Pedro, and you can try to institute his policies. And if you succeed, this progress bar is going to move a little bit to the right. And if Pedro dies while the progress bar is quite full, it doesn't have to be all full, but if Pedro dies and has succeeded in most of his things, then he will be succeeded by his daughter, and then the sort of progressive project in Brazil can continue. But if he's taken a lot of setbacks, or the progress bar goes all the way to 0 because of the events that have transpired throughout the game, in part by events and in part by mechanics, then Pedro's reign will not continue. And the landowners and armed forces, political factions, will basically have a coup and take over and institute a republic instead. And the player can choose to side with them as well. But there is a very clear progression here to the player and a constant reminder of this is a thing that is happening. And when we serve up events relating to this, it's very clearly associated. And this was the kind of compromise that we discovered in terms of enforcing historicity, or not enforcing a historical progression, but enforcing the sense of historicity. We can't take something like the reign of Pedro II and turn that into a general game mechanic that applies to all countries. It's a very Brazil-specific context that this occurs in. But we also want to make sure that players understand that this is relating specifically to Pedro, this event, right? So this is the key aspect that we're kind of using now when we are creating more random events, is rather than disconnecting them and adding them to a general pool, it's something that we sort of lock behind these journal entries. Journal entries have a bunch of extra features. We've added more things over time. The game launched like last year. For those of you who don't work this way, that might sound alien, but we continue to develop on our games and expand mechanics and iterate on them for many years after launch. So we've added more functions to these over time. So these have more aggressive trigger conditions than events because we want them to only occur under specific circumstances. But because they're also restrictive, means that we can show them to players before they actually become active. So we have this concept in the journal panel called inactive journal entries. So players can see that in order for this kind of journal entry to occur, then I have to create these kinds of conditions in my country, which aids a lot in discoverability and player agency. This also has the same kind of smart scoping as we have with events, but it's much more aggressive because these need to stick around for a longer period of time. This particular journal entry can be in action for up to 50 years, so half the game. And we have to make sure that the conditions under which this journal entry is valid remain so throughout. So we make sure that we set all the preconditions when this journal entry fires, and the journal entry itself has logic to kind of make sure that the validity is kept intact. And we've added, you can see there's a few buttons up here. They're inactive right now because they're not clickable. But this is basically like custom actions that we can script in, which basically lets us make new game mechanics purely in script without adding anything to code that is only available for this particular mission, right? And that is basically the solution that we found to the initial problem of how do we make sure that players feel immersed but still have agency, feel like there is a historical progression, that they understand why is this happening, but without losing the sense of historical authenticity that they're looking for. Is we find specific game states, and we attach and we sort of craft these narrative vectors around them, and then attach random events to those. And my takeaway for you here is this is how we solve this specific problem. We continue to use sort of similar methods and processes for solving other conflicts that come up. So how do you do it? Look at a model, find a model that works for you. Maybe the model that I presented is not the best one for everybody, but find a model that works for you and analyze your problems through that, and find how you can solve your narrative design problems using those. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. I think we can open the floor up for a few questions. We've got some time. Folks, you can just raise your hands up, and we have a mic going about. Do you have a question?
I really like the font color palette here. Here. I like the color palette of your presentation, and I'm intrigued by the game. I want to play it very soon. So my question is, I have played few interactive detective games. All those games always led me to the...
I can't hear very well. Can you speak a little louder?
I played a few detective interactive games.
Yep.
All of them have gave me clues and led me to solving the mystery. So I do not know how to reveal the climax.
How to reveal the...
catching the mystery. Okay. So in my design, I'm struggling to give clues. Am I forcing them? How to strike that balance? Should I force the clues to the player, or should I let them find them?
Should I close the...
Should I force the clues to the player, or how should I strike that balance? Should I let the player find those clues?
The clues?
Yeah.
For the clues towards what?
Clues towards solving the mystery. In an interactive detective game.
In an interactive video game. Oh, that's an unexpected question, but maybe I can find an answer. So should you expect the player to find the clues? I think you should. It depends very much on what your game is about. If your game is very much about exploration, for example, then maybe it's fine to let the player engage with the environment a lot, and it depends on how much emphasis you put on the environment and the assets that you make, right? In order to discover those things that could be part of the journey, right? But if the game is very plot focused and very focused around the sort of cerebral puzzle of the mystery, then my sense is in similar games that I've played is that it's better to give the player a lot of information and let them draw their own conclusions. So I think actually, for example, Disco Elysium is a great example of this. They don't. It's not a game where you constantly hunt for clues. They give you all the information, but then your decision making is what's important, and that really affects how the characters interact with you and how the story progresses.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions? Okay. Could you somewhere central? Yeah.
Hey, Mikhail. Thank you for that. I had a question. So, because you posed the problem that it's about balancing agency, immersion, and transformation,
Yeah.
have you found instances in Victoria where people want immersion? I feel like when coming into an historical game, that's the first thing you're looking for is immersion. They maybe want specific events. And how do you make up for player expectation from the get-go? When the game boots up, how does it, and have you managed to find a way that, hey, you're not going to maybe necessarily get into World War II in Victoria 3? How
Right.
do you set that up?
Yeah, so that's a great question because setting expectations is actually, it's a little bit of a cheat code, right? You tell the player what to expect. And I mean, the marketing material for the game is pretty clear about it ends in 1936. You're not going to experience World War II here. But within the context of that, it can be tricky because, for example, World War I is a good example here. Players might expect that they will find World War I within the context of the game, but there's no specific event that sort of triggers it because it occurs so late in the timeline that for us to try to force World War I, that seems like the whole thing is unavoidable, which doesn't make sort of cognitive sense, right? Like, if you can change the entire world and turn Britain into an autocratic, tyrannical empire or something, right? Like, if you can do that, then why would World War I happen in a way that's recognizable? So, but this is very much, I think, where the narrative vector design pattern can come in, because we haven't done this yet, but it's definitely something that we're going to explore in the future, is even for late game events like this, try to find trigger conditions that are reminiscent to World War I, and then find narrative trappings, what players would expect to see, what gives them a World War I feel. Embed that in the journal entry and say, oh, because of this conflict that didn't occur in the Balkans and then spread from there, because of this conflict that occurred somewhere entirely else in the world, you now have this spark of different great powers getting involved on different sides, and players should be able to recognize that as World War I equivalent, while still ensuring that they feel like, yeah, they're playing a historical game, but they have the ability to transform the world in the process. Right?
Awesome. Okay, so we have one last question. We have time for one last question. Anyone in the back? Or, yeah, all right.
Hi, Mikhail. It's so nice to speak to you because I'm a huge fan of CK3 and CK2. I wanted to know, so how do you decide what is the frequency of these random events that pop up, and what percentage of it is like based on like your current gameplay? So that is one route, and the other route is like, how do you decide, okay, at 30 minutes this event is going to pop up irrespective of how you play the game? And like what consequences do those have versus like your regular gameplay? Suppose like there's like a random event happening and some players might choose to just skip it in a hurry. So how much effect do those have on your like choices? That's my question.
How much effect? Sorry, there is a terrible echo here that makes it really hard for me to hear. But how much effect? Can you restate the last part?
Yeah, over here. Yeah.
There you are.
So there are those random events that pop up, right? And you have to make a choice. So like a lot of players might tend to skip it in a hurry if they're in like a battle going on, and they might just choose to ignore it or not give it so much attention. So although in these games they have actual consequences, how much effect do they have versus your regular gameplay without those random events occurring?
How much effect they have on the gameplay outside of random events?
Yes.
That's a core part of the game. Okay. So the core part of the game is really about One of the core loops, for example, is like constructing industry, deciding what to build where, how to expand your infrastructure, things like that. And then like what laws to enact, what diplomatic pacts to create with other countries. But those are all part of the sort of core mechanics. And then where the random events come in, they're really important for the historical immersion, to give the players a sense that they're playing through history. They also need to feel transformative enough that they have an impact on the mechanics so that they can have this kind of mosaic effect that I talked about. Otherwise, they just seem like filler or noise. We need to strike a balance basically there, where the game definitely cannot be described as being purely event-driven. Crusader Kings, as an example, is much, much more driven by events than Victoria is. But it's still important that players get these and that they feel like they matter, but that they also then get them in the context where it feels like this is what matters right now.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And also, how do you decide the frequency of the random events?
Decide the sequencing?
Frequency. How often they pop up?
Yeah, that's another design problem. But we have basically cooldown mechanics for events, so we can say that a certain event can only spawn so often, and then another timer that's basically like how long since the player got any event last. Because that's a common problem otherwise, is that a certain event might trigger too often, certain events might not trigger at all, certain events become orphaned, and you just never see them in the game. So developing that sequencing mechanic is tricky, but we have like the core engine that all of our games are built on, that's like over 20 years old, and we've been sort of gradually adding more and more facilities for pacing events around that. But yeah, the journal entries that I mentioned during the talk, they also have their own internal pacing mechanism, right? So there's a certain library of events that belong to them, and then they dole them out over time when it makes sense.
I think that's the end of the Q&A session. Can we have a big round of applause for Michael, please? And thanks for making all the way for this, and we'd like to give you a little